So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Shakina, for being with us. So, Shakina Rajendram is an assistant professor, teaching stream, and the coordinator of the language teaching field in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at OISE, University of Toronto. Shakina, you graduated with a PhD in Language and Literacies Education and a collaborative specialization in Comparative, International and Development Education from OISE in 2019. You have a long-standing experience of teaching linguistically and culturally diverse students in the K to 12 and higher education levels, and your current research focuses on teacher education and supporting multilingual learners through translanguaging and multiliteracy pedagogies. Anything to add to this description?
No, that you've captured it all. Thank you, Emmanuel.
Okay, so thank you, Shakina, for being with us tonight. And the interview will start right now.
Okay. So sorry. Our first question is from me, Himani. We heard about you being a recent graduate from OISE and also a graduate from many different schools across the globe. How did you use your graduate experience to define and refine your own research?
Thank you. That's such a great question to start us off with. I will perhaps talk a little bit about my experiences as a teacher and then connect it to my graduate experience and how that shaped my research trajectory, both in my PhD and beyond. As Emmanuel mentioned, I have had experience teaching multilingual students in various contexts. I first started teaching in Malaysia, which is a country in Southeast Asia where I was born and where I grew up. And the very first school that I taught in was an elementary, or what we call a primary school, serving students from grades 1 all the way to grade 6. And I was posted or by the government of Malaysia in that school to teach English as a second language. And on my very first day actually of teaching, I, observed that a majority of students in that school were Malaysian-born Indians, as I am as well, and they spoke Tamil as their first language. So the first day of school, the parents as well, they would usually come and send their students off and so on. And so parents as well as their students would come up to me and they would start asking me questions in Tamil. I do speak Tamil. It's one of my second languages, but I don't consider myself to be that proficient in Tamil. And so the feeling I got when other teachers and students and parents came up to me and asked me a whole bunch of questions in Tamil was deep anxiety. I felt anxious. I felt self-conscious because I knew the answers to their questions. I could understand every question, but I didn't have the confidence to be able to respond in my second language, Tamil. And in that moment, I realized that this feeling of anxiety, this feeling of self-consciousness, this feeling of inadequacy that I was experiencing as a teacher was actually the same feeling that my students would experience every day in a classroom where they were not allowed to use their first language to communicate their ideas and respond to questions. And so I made it a point on the very first day of my career as a teacher in that school to never go into a classroom and make any student speak only in English, which was the subject I was being trained and paid to teach. So the relationship that I had with my students back in that school was a very different one where I introduced myself in my first year of teaching as someone who was there to learn Tamil from them, as opposed to someone who was there to teach them English. And this was very different, a very different approach for them because their experience in an ESL classroom had always been teachers coming in and saying, "We're here to learn English, and I don't want you to speak in any other language because you're here to practice your English." So students we started to form a different relationship where we were participants in the learning process. We were sharing and exchanging languages all the time. I was there learning Tamil from them. They would laugh at me when I mispronounced things. We would laugh together. We had, just a really collaborative and really nice relationship where they were the experts in the classroom. I wasn't the expert. I didn't know what any of this was called. Using other languages, bringing in multilingual resources. I did not have a name or a theory to put to it as I hadn't done my PhD yet. I was just a practicing teacher at that time, full time. It was only when I started my PhD at OISE in 2014 and then started attending conferences where I first heard the terms plurilingualism and translanguaging being used. I remember a light bulb moment when I attended AAAL conference, which some of you were at a few weeks ago, back in 2015, where Dr. Suresh Kanagaraja was giving a talk, and the talk was about translanguaging. This was the very first time I heard the term translanguaging, and it was a light bulb moment for me because all of a sudden everything made sense. My experience as a student in Malaysia, my experience as a teacher, my experience with the benefits of incorporating multilingualism into the classroom, it was all being so eloquently described in Dr. Suresh Kanagaraja's talk, and where he described translanguaging theory and translanguaging pedagogy, and subsequently in talks that I attended on plurilingualism as well. And so that was, a significant moment for me in helping me determine that I did want to connect my PhD dissertation to my own lived experiences as a teacher and as a student in Malaysia. And I returned to Malaysia halfway through my PhD. I spent 6 months there to subsequently do my PhD dissertation. So coming back to your question about how I use my graduate experience to define and refine my research, my graduate experience was very much informed by my experiences as a student and a teacher, and vice versa. My experiences as a student and a teacher were also informed and shaped by then the information about translanguaging and plurilingualism that I received through the course of my graduate studies. And after graduation, I've continued to pursue a research and teaching trajectory focusing on translanguaging and plurilingual pedagogies, but now in a different context, in the context of working with teacher candidates in Canada, as well as multilingual students in the K-12 classroom and international students in Canadian universities.
Thank you so much for your response. I really liked when you spoke about connecting your thesis and your research back to your own lived experiences, and how that also connects back to your research, how it plays a hand in both. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I read your thesis, and I fully can feel that you are passionate about helping the kids, especially for the English only class. You recognize that they want to use your home language. However, I think for some monolingual teachers, they may have some anxiety that they cannot use the translanguaging pedagogy. So I wonder, is there any training program could support the monolingual teacher here in Canada?
Absolutely. That's an important concern. In fact, every time I talk about translanguaging, about plurilingualism in my courses at OISE, as well as at conference presentations, at professional development workshops, that's the number one question that comes up. I am a monolingual, or I don't speak the same home languages as the students in my classroom, especially in a diverse context like Canada. And in Toronto, I think there are over 200 languages spoken by students in the Toronto District School Board alone. And so that's a common and a valid concern that comes up with teachers. I'm not aware of training programs that focus specifically on working with monolingual teachers, but I could maybe respond to the question by talking about the strategies and recommendations that I usually provide in my training courses at OISE to my teacher candidates, and then to in-service teachers in the LLE program as well, when they ask me this question about how I as a monolingual teacher can support my students. And the first response, really, before giving them any strategies, is I just try to help them address the idea of, unpack the idea of what it means to be monolingual, and to help them just come to the understanding actually of themselves as plurilinguals. Because I think the first challenge is just the mindset. If you think of yourself as a monolingual, that is an ideological barrier that might stop you from even trying to implement plurilingual pedagogies. So we do activities like, the plurilingual portrait. I do an activity called Language Flowers, where I get students to make petals to represent the different languages that they have interacted with in their environment. I show them from the CFR that many of you are interested in, the descriptors of plurilingual and pluricultural competencies. Just today, some of you may have been in my classes today, where I went through a checklist of plurilingual competencies, and I was convincing my students that, hey, you all have these plurilingual competencies. And I find that when that ideological shift happens, when teachers or teacher candidates come to see themselves as plurilingual as well, then there's that, they start to be more open towards implementing plurilingual approaches. But of course, there's still the practical challenge. If you go into a classroom and you're not familiar with the 10 or 20 or 50 languages spoken in that school board, it's still a challenge. And so some practical strategies that I recommend is one, using multilingual resources. We have so much access nowadays online to digital media in different languages, to books, to storybooks, to online books in other languages. They're freely and readily available online. We have access to translation tools as well, even though they're not always accurate. They are incredibly helpful. So even if the teacher is monolingual, the teacher, by providing resources in students' home languages, can create the environment where multilingualism is welcome and it's seen as a resource in the classroom. I always encourage collaboration as well, even if a teacher does not speak the exact same languages as their students. They can draw on the expertise of other teachers or of community members or family members who do speak that language, build bridges between what happens in the classroom and what happens at home as well, and involve family members and community members in supporting students' language learning as well. And I think the most important thing is creating an ongoing culture where students' languages are welcome. Even if the teacher learns the word hello in many languages, and that's not too difficult to just learn the word hello. I think greeting students by saying hello in your home language, that sends a powerful message that I value your linguistic background. I have made the attempt to try to learn these words in your language because it's important to you and it's important to me. So even small steps like learning these words and having visuals in your classroom that represent different languages, I think can send a strong message to students that multilingualism is a part of our teaching and learning here, and it doesn't require you to be proficient in every language to be able to do that. So thank you for that really important question.
Thank you. I think the most takeaway from your sharing is that we, as a teacher, we are lifelong learner. We should not just define us as a monolingual teacher. That's a really important mindset changing. And another thing is that I do like your last tips, greeting students in their language. I remember that when the Spring Festival happened, you gave all of us a red pockets. We were all very appreciative about that, and we felt that you really respect our own cultural identity, and you did that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And that brings up a good point. Plurilingualism, translanguaging is not just about language, it's about culture as well. So even by learning about important cultural celebrations, important cultural values of your students, and a simple thing that I did, I'm glad that you remembered it, just bringing in ang paos or red packets to give to my students during the Lunar New Year, that means so much to the student. And again, this doesn't require me as the teacher to know every language spoken by students to be able to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakina. I love the insights that you've given, especially just on a teacher candidate level. But my question actually comes from an institutional level. So what would be specific strategies and initiatives that higher education institutions could implement for translanguaging to ensure that those classrooms are more inclusive?
Thank you. Such an important question, Stephanie. I am grateful that you brought this consideration up. You remember from my article in the Canadian, sorry, not sorry, in the I'm just looking at the journal again, from the Critical Inquiry in Language Studies journal, the article on translanguaging in higher education, where we talked to students, university students from global south countries about the experiences in higher education. You may remember that a theme that frequently came up was that there was a lack of consistency between what they experience across courses and across even instructors within the same course as well. And so I think, going back to your question about higher education and strategies and initiatives that can be implemented to make classrooms more inclusive, the answer to that is that it really needs to start at the level of policy. If translanguaging, if plurilingualism, if they're not clearly stated in the policy at the university, at the policy level, as being pedagogies and approaches that are important to the university, then I feel like there will always be inconsistencies in the practices and the classroom language policies of instructors across the university. So it does need to be officially, I think, put into the policy. And at the level of the program or the department, it is important, as the students in my study recommended, of providing training in translanguaging for course instructors and for staff members as well. The level of training, I think, will differ depending on what the goals of the program are. But I think that there does need to be some kind of training in how students' languages can be welcomed and how classrooms can be made more inclusive. Another recommendation brought up by students in that study as well is the importance of diversifying instructors, diversifying advisors in writing centers, diversifying staff members, diversifying even students who are admitted into universities. Several students in that study talked about or expressed a strong desire to actually see instructors who represented them, who represented their linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Several students expressed their desire to be able to go for writing support from not white native speakers of English, but actually from multilingual speakers of English who would be able to identify with the challenges of writing academically or speaking academically in a second language, and to be able to provide not just the academic support, but also the emotional support that's needed. And I could go on with the list of other practical recommendations to make higher education classrooms more inclusive. But I think I'll go back to the point that I made at the beginning, that there needs to be a concerted effort at different levels. So at the university level in terms of policy, at the department level in terms of training that new staff members and instructors receive, and then of course at the level of the classroom itself. I believe that it's important for all instructors to going back to the theme of collaboration that I mentioned in the response to the first question, I think it's important for instructors to communicate with each other about the practices that they implement in their classroom. For example, in my course today on planning and organizing the second language curriculum, one of my students gave me an example of her instructor in another course at OISE, who is encouraging all of their students to submit their assignments multilingually. And so that was important and useful for me to hear, because it gave me an idea about how I could make my classroom more inclusive. And I would never have known what that other course instructor is doing in their course if not for the student who brought it to my attention. So I think that speaks to the importance of even instructors within a program, speaking to each other and planning collaboratively to implement translanguaging across their courses, so that students experience the welcoming and inclusion of their languages in a consistent way.
Thank you so much, Shakina. I don't think I was really expecting actually such a multi-layered response. Like in my mind, I was thinking at a very, like, for example, U of T level. And I think you really took it so much further. So thank you so much for that response.
Thank you.
Hi, Shakina. So you noted policy, especially to Stephanie's question about how higher education can implement things to promote translanguaging. And so you noted, starting at the policy level, and the question before that, you talked about kind of the ground up. So from the classroom and in terms of practicing and practices. My question is about translanguaging sort of in that middle ground at a school board level. For example, translanguaging is noted approximately 4 times in Ontario's new language curriculum that just came out in September 2023. And so what do you think translanguaging means for English literacy instruction, particularly for current teachers who are now taking on this new curriculum with maybe no awareness of translanguaging? Different from obviously if we were to take on that curriculum after being in this course and being here at OISE, and who is monitoring this? So what is that in terms of looking like in terms of accountability?
I was very excited to hear that translanguaging is now mentioned 4 times, as you said, in the new language curriculum. I am grateful for your question because prior to you bringing it up, I was not aware about this, and so I'm excited that it's now being, acknowledged at the policy level. And when I glanced through the use of the word translanguaging in policy, I was also happy to see that they talk about translanguaging actually not just as a resource but as a right. They use the word right and emphasize the rights that multilingual students have to use their first language, which is more powerful language. I know that for many years, the curriculum documents, specifically curriculum documents for English as a second language programming in the K-12 setting, did talk about, did draw on Professor Jim Cummins' work a lot and talk about the importance of asset-based approaches, talked about the importance of recognizing students' languages. But I think this was a strong move rhetorically in talking about the use of students' languages as their rights. And I hope that that sends a stronger message to teachers and to administrators about the importance, not just the advantages, but actually the importance, the imperative need to teach multilingually. So I do think that it has the potential to mark a significant shift in the approach to English literacy and language arts instruction at schools. But for it to be implemented, it's different. It doesn't mean it's one thing to have it written down as an important thing in policy, but it's another thing for it to actually be implemented consistently in the classroom. So I do think that it needs to be accompanied by action. It needs to be accompanied by professional development and training, both for in-service teachers who have been teaching for a long time, as well as pre-service teachers who are preparing to teach. And also I would add new teachers who have just graduated. So I do think that they need to receive that pedagogical training in okay, how to actually enact these multilingual approaches such as translanguaging in terms of lesson planning, in terms of planning accommodations and modifications for students, even in terms of assessment. Just adopting the mindset that translanguaging is important is not enough if it's not accompanied by changes not only in teachers' practices but also changes in programming. So the way that English as a second language programs, for example, are being implemented, it also needs to be accompanied by changes in assessment structures. Right now, the K-12 school board in Ontario, the steps to English proficiency assessment is used to assess the language abilities of multilingual learners who are newcomers to Canada or to Ontario. I should be more specific. And the step assessment doesn't always account for students' other languages as assets. In fact, it uses some deficit-based language about students' first languages. And so if we don't change things like programming, if we don't change things like professional development and what they focus on, if we don't change things like the assessment, then the mention of translanguaging is going to just remain at the policy level and never actually permeate classroom and transform instruction in classroom. We also need buy-in from students themselves and their families. Teachers may be very excited, enthusiastic about translanguaging, but if families don't understand the need for translanguaging, then there could be a resistance, and students may be using these amazing multilingual approaches in school and then go home to an environment where now the parents tell them, hey, you're in Canada now, you should only be speaking in English so that you can improve your English most effectively. So I think, all stakeholders, including parents, including guardians and community members, need to come to understand the rationale for translanguaging, how it benefits their children in terms of content learning, language learning, affirming their identity, how it benefits them in terms of the overall well-being. So, my hope is that the mention of translanguaging doesn't stay at the policy level, but it goes into all of the aspects that I mentioned, such as training, assessment, programming, and communication with parents and community members as well.
Thank you so much. One thing I really appreciate is that you note the use of translanguaging in the new curriculum as marking a significant step because of the way it's used and the words used, that it's a right, that children have a right to using their language as they explore the English language curriculum. And I think as you then went on to say the buy-in from families, the buy-in from teachers, the buy-in from administrators, that then gives, let's say, a teacher who's really trying to mobilize it in their school grounds to stand on, which is very helpful. And the second piece I appreciated as well is you looping the families into this, because oftentimes at the policy level, or even when we get wrapped up in the day-to-day of things, we sometimes forget the important stakeholders that are the families, and how their lived experiences or their perceptions of what it means to immigrate to a new land, what the implications might be on language learning. And so part of that is also having conversations with families and sharing in that education and learning. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for that great question.
Thank you, Shakina. So I am a bit confused about the translanguaging as a pedagogy and what is really happening on the ground, especially in the context of Ontario. Because from what I understand, translanguaging is basically encouraging all of us to recognize all languages, they have a value. All languages, they are equal in a way. But at the same time, in a ground level, still the immersion program is still implemented too for language teaching. So do you think there is a gap between the promoting translanguaging and promoting every language is valuable, while what happening on the ground is actually, immersion and eventually will lead to this monolingual ideology? Do you think there is a gap?
Yes, absolutely. I do think there's a gap. I mean, I can't speak to how big the gap is, but yes, there is a gap between translanguaging as a stand. So, what we know about and what we believe about translanguaging, and translanguaging as a pedagogy in terms of how it's actually being implemented. And before going to your question about French immersion programs, I'll just take this conversation back a little bit to my other article in the Canadian Journal of Applied Linguistics about teacher candidates. We saw that gap even in what teacher candidates were saying and what they were doing. So we learned, as the instructor for the Supporting English Language Learners course in the Master of Teaching program at OISE, for example, I talk a lot about translanguaging and plurilingualism. And in students' assignments, such as their unit plans, their lesson plans, they do demonstrate an openness towards it. They do recognize the value of incorporating students' languages, and there is that genuine desire to want to incorporate translanguaging and plurilingualism in their instruction. However, when it came to their lesson planning, so the lesson plans that they developed, the unit plans that they developed, the materials that they developed, the accommodations that they were planning for their students, the modifications to curriculum, and so on, we started seeing that gap or that disconnect between what they thought and believed about translanguaging and what they actually did, where sometimes it didn't really translate into practice because they still had the English learning goals in mind, as they do in immersion programs or the ESL curriculum programs. They have the goal of learning the target language in mind, and maybe they're not able to see yet how translanguaging and plurilingualism can still lead to the target language being developed. And this goes back, hundreds of years ago to different hypotheses that existed in the field of applied linguistics back then. Like we learned about the input hypothesis and how the more input students have in a certain language, the more proficient they will be. And of course, like hypotheses like that, theories like that have been discredited and have been challenged, because we know now that an immersion program alone is not the solution to addressing students' lack of language. In fact, I read a student's PhD proposal recently where she was talking about how the French immersion program in Ontario is not always successful because it doesn't actually lead to high proficiency in the language. So the idea that immersing students in a particular language is the best way to improve someone's language proficiency, that's not always the case. And so going back to your question about how to balance the contradiction between goals and the practice of translanguaging, specifically in the context of like French immersion and ESL curriculum programs, I can only speak on a general level because I myself have not been a teacher or a student in the ESL or French immersion program in Ontario. But I do think that we need to have more of, sorry, this theme of collaboration keeps coming up through my responses. But I think that in terms of, instead of compartmentalizing those programs, like compartmentalizing the French program with the English program or the FSL program with the ESL program, I think there would be a nice opportunity to kind of talk across the programs and to look at how language learning goals can be facilitated across languages. So, today in my planning and organizing the second language curriculum course, we were looking at the case study of Switzerland, where there are up to 3 languages that are taught officially in the school setting, with the German, French, and English, for example. And really interesting that came up in the case study of Switzerland is that across the teaching of English, French, and German in a school system, all of the teachers who teach those 3 languages, they will have similar aims, so similar goals, and they will also use similar content for all of their lessons, and they will coordinate the topics and content so that students are encountering similar topics, similar grammatical skills, similar tasks, similar texts in different languages, but across those programs. And the teachers also use the same evaluation criteria so that there isn't a privileging of one language over the others in terms of assessment. And the most important thing is that across the German, French, and English teaching programs in Swiss schools, the core principles of multilingualism, such as translanguaging and plurilingualism, are made known to all teachers and are shared by all. So teachers, regardless of what type of program they're in, immersion or core French, or if they're teaching multilingually, they all adopt and they believe and they buy into the importance of multilingualism as an approach. And I thought that that was such a great model. I'm not sure if that model can be adopted, exactly to this context, probably not. But I thought that was a really great way of thinking about how teachers across languages could be collaborating so that there isn't a competition between languages, and so that we don't think that plurilingualism cannot work in immersion because it will take away from learning one language. We just don't want to have that type of competitive nature of looking at language learning, but instead looking at how languages can support each other and how teachers can support each other as well.
I really like the way you gave the example in the Swiss school, so that using translanguaging to promote multiple languages at the same time, and to support like students' language proficiency in different languages. So that is very promising while using translanguaging. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, Sakina. So we have been talking like how in your articles, you're working with rich qualitative data and you provide a good overview of thematic analytical process and developing analytical coding schemes. So since some of us are also considering working with qualitative data, I wonder if you could talk about the methodological issues that you have experienced during the analysis stage of your research.
Yeah, sure. One thing I discovered during my PhD, and I continue to discover, is that analysis can be messy. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think analysis is meant to be messy because it means that you're engaging in a dynamic way. You're changing your mind, and changing your mind is a good thing because it means that your mind is being opened to new things as you see the data and as you're engaging in when you're thick of the data analysis. But maybe speaking hopefully briefly to the method of data analysis that we end up using in both articles. The articles are on slightly different topics, but we did use a similar approach where we combined both deductive and inductive approaches to data analysis. So there wasn't there wasn't like one particular framework that we were using deductively, but we did instead for the article on international students' experiences with translanguaging, we started by doing a literature review of what the scholarship has said thus far, of research studies that exist thus far on the topic of translanguaging in higher education, specifically with international students. And as we were developing that literature review, we came up with themes, so themes that we saw in the literature, and these themes became the deductive codes that we first applied deductively to the data. But as we did so, of course, as I talked earlier, analysis is messy, and so we realized very importantly that the deductive codes could not just be applied in a very neat an objective manner to the analysis, because the analysis was showing us like nuanced findings. Our analysis was focused on students in one particular program in one particular university with a very specific culture, with a very specific of academic program and so on. So then that's where we also introduced the inductive analysis, where we began shifting and changing the codes as well to reflect what we were learning inductively from the analysis. And we used a similar approach to with the other article speaking that addressed teacher candidates approaches towards translanguaging in their lesson planning. We first looked at the literature on translanguaging and what frameworks had been used to analyze or to think about translanguaging practices. And that's where we saw Sinos and Gorda's framework of spontaneous versus intentional translanguaging. We saw, other distinctions in frameworks such as the difference between classroom or planned translanguaging and again, spontaneous translanguaging. We saw in the literature categories such as teacher-directed translanguaging and student-directed translanguaging, pedagogic translanguaging versus non-pedagogic translanguaging, and so on. So initially, we used these categories that we had seen in the literature and the theoretical frameworks around translanguaging to start to analyze some of the data deductively. And again, using the same process as in the other research study, we started making changes to those codes based on what we were getting, through an, more of an emergent approach towards the data. So codes began to emerge naturally from the data analysis as well. And that led to then us finally compiling those codes into a framework which we proposed in that article, where we look at monolingual and translanguaging stands. We look at translanguaging as either a scaffold towards English only or as a multilingual resource. We look at things like supporting multimodality or supporting monomodality, where multimodality is not included in students' repertoires. And we developed that framework, which we then reapplied to our analysis. So, it was a messy process, but it taught us many things about research, and it taught us how to also bring theories that already exist with data that emerges from the bottom up, and how to find a middle ground between the bottom up and the top down approaches.
Thank you for highlighting the iterative nature of data analysis and also talking about your own experience with qualitative data analysis.
But was it already answered? Do you still want to ask your question, Bing?
Yes, I have a little bit question regards about the curriculum design, because I found this because before I do my PhD, I also worked as a classroom teacher, and I tried to do some kind of lesson plans and try to use it to do some research. So my question related to how to rationale this kind of trial and how to validate this curriculum design or units design corresponding to a kind of theory or something. So how to validate it?
Right. I think I hope I'm not misunderstanding your question, but I think to respond to that, I'm going to go back to what I just talked about, bringing theoretical frameworks, but then looking at how, or making sure that it's informed by what's naturally happening in terms of the data as well. So now let me connect it to your question about lesson planning. I think we can design a really beautiful lesson or curriculum with translanguaging and plurilingualism on it. But at the end of the day, it has to be responsive to what students actually need. And that goes back to the three components of a translanguaging pedagogy, where there's a translanguaging stance, which is the belief that students' languages are valuable. There's a translanguaging design, which is the design of lesson plans. But the most important part, which often gets forgotten, is translanguaging shifts. So translanguaging shifts involves the ability to make moment-by-moment changes to your beautiful lesson plans according to how students are responding, according to their actual needs. And I like that you use the word validate, as well. Those are really important words. I think, in terms of like general layman terms, I think we're talking about looking at, hey, do my lesson plans and my beautiful translanguaging and plurilingual activities, do they actually match what students need Do they
Mhm.
match the way that students themselves are naturally using language? Do they meet the goals of students and their identities and how they identify themselves as multilingual users? So I think, we need to make sure as well as teachers that we're open to making changes to our instruction, to our lesson planning and so on, depending on how it's received by students. And so translanguaging plurilingualism cannot be set in stone. I really appreciate the guidebooks. There are amazing guidebooks like Angelica Galante and her team at McGill. They developed a plurilingual guidebook. In the US, with CUNY NICEP, with the City University of New York, they have amazing translanguaging resources like translanguaging guides. And I give all of these resources to my students, but I always remind them that these are just guidelines. These are not rules. There are no rules for how you implement translanguaging and plurilingualism. So the only way to using it or to kind of validate the impact of your lesson planning of your curriculum is actually take it back to the students and to see how they're receiving it and if it actually has a positive impact on their identity, their emotional engagement, their intellectual engagement in the classroom, and on their multilingual development as well. I hope I'm answering your question, or at least part of it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, get to know that. Yeah, thank you very much.
So Shakina, going back to the methodological design, another thing we were discussing is how you use the concept of the global south, to describe the participants of your study with international students' experiences with translanguaging. And I have been reading some criticisms about this notion of the global south.
Mhm.
Mostly they refer to how they continue, emphasizing the divide between developing and developed countries, or how they put together countries that are very diverse. So our question is, why did you decide to use this concept of the global south, and how did it apt this research?
Thank you. That's such an important question. And to be honest, it's a question that I've been thinking a lot about as well and grappling with and thinking critically about as well. I am familiar with some of the criticisms that you raise about how using the term Global South could further perpetuate that divide that we have between, developed countries and developing countries, or, the global North and global South and so on. But I think most of the time that relates to using the term Global South as a geographical marker when we're trying to think about countries north and south of the equator and so on. There are many critical scholars that use the term Global South not as a geographical term, but as an ideological term to describe countries and contexts around the world that have experienced colonialism, that have experienced the hegemonies of the North and the control that they've imposed on them. And it's being used by critical scholars such as D'Souza Santos, Ophelia Garcia, Nelson Flores, and so on, to talk about an ideological stance to express that resistance towards colonialism from the global north. So in my work so far, and I'm still trying to figure it out as we go, and I really appreciate your question. When I use the term global south, I'm not referring to it simply as a geographical position, but I'm looking at even talking about the global north in Canada. When I write about the global south, I'm talking about student populations or community groups that have experienced the exclusion, the silencing, and the marginalization that the colonized context in the global south have experienced. And I think the concept of the global south is especially important in Canada being a white settler nation, a colonial nation. Students, particularly from racialized contexts, particularly from geographical global south countries, they have continued to experience linguistic colonialism in higher education, racial colonialism in higher education through the exclusion of their languages and their modes of meaning making from official university policies and practices. And so while I could have used the term, for example, international students, I think I wanted the research to be political and to really express the exclusion and silencing that can continue to perpetuate linguistic colonization and ideologies of the global south, even in a context like the geographical north or the global north. So I, continue to think about this as well and to think about how I am situated within the literature on the global south. I mentioned earlier on in my presentation that I come from Malaysia. Malaysia has experienced colonialism for over 450 years by many different European powers. And so my experiences growing up, my experiences of translanguaging cannot be separated from the colonial struggles that my great-grandparents experienced, that my grandparents experienced, and the continued colonial legacies and impacts that exist on our policies and our language practices. Like we continue to experience that impact of colonialism, even many, many hundreds of years later. And so I feel like my work on translanguaging really cannot be separated from my experiences of colonialism in the global South, specifically in Southeast Asia, where I'm from. And so that's the perspective that I am bringing to my research when I talk about global South, and I position myself as a scholar with the perspective of translanguaging from the global South. But I feel like this is something that we need to continue talking about, and it's important to talk to people who identify geographically from context in the global South as well, to make sure that we're not using the term in ways that further marginalize them, as you pointed out.
Thank you so much for this insight. I think it's so relevant, to be clear about how political stance, it's also, permeating your research and informing your research, and how it connects again to your identity and your positionality as a researcher. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to echo from that sentiment, given that the way that you were just talking about Global South and talking about how you implement it in your work and how it's an ongoing kind of critical engagement with the term and with the beliefs and the concepts that come with it in research. I think the question that I have is kind of coming from a similar place. When we were reflecting on this as a group earlier, we came across this quote from Audre Lorde, which is the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Mm-hmm. And I think from one angle, we can consider students from the global South who are studying or maybe eventually publishing in institutions in the global North. However, we can also think, and I think you mentioned this in an earlier response, needing buy-in from students and families who might be coming from global South context, in which there are these beliefs that get internalized about English as power, for instance. So I think the question I'm coming with is how can translanguaging as a pedagogical tool effectively bridge people coming from these perspectives of maybe monolingualism being turned against them effectively? How can we use translanguaging as buy-in potential for people coming from global South context?
Thank you. Such a powerful, really powerful question. Translanguaging cannot be apolitical. It cannot be implemented in a way that's disconnected from critical movements, from political movements. Translanguaging cannot be implemented just as a pedagogy, because going back to that quote, it speaks volumes about the real struggle that we have against systems and the need for approaches that will effect real change at the systemic level and really dismantle that oppressive structures. And so if translanguaging is only implemented as a pedagogy, just as a language teaching strategy, it could effect change temporarily. But then when oppressive systems come back, so oppressive systems such as English-only policies in curriculum, or standardized assessments that are only in English or the target language, when these systems come back to oppress racialized and minoritized linguistic communities, the effects of translanguaging, they're going to diminish. And so that's why translanguaging has to be always accompanied by a critical orientation to really examining hierarchies and subverting those dynamics of hierarchies and the effects of colonialism in education as well. And so with my PhD research, which I started this presentation off with, I was able to document through my analysis many of the benefits. So the cognitive benefits, the linguistic benefits, the language learning benefits, the collaborative social benefits. But that was not enough, because if we're focusing on translanguaging and only its potential for learning, going back to that point earlier, it's never going to really change the broader structures. Students are still going to go outside of the classroom and experience the effects of colonialism. They're still going to experience the pressure to conform to English only instruction in order to make it in life, in order to gain admission to higher education, in order to get jobs and so on. So I think that, sorry, going back to my PhD research again, I needed to look at multiple levels, and I needed to look at what we can do to ensure that there's not just a pedagogical shift happening in the classroom, but an ideological shift happening as well, where teachers, where the administrators, where the principals, where the parents, they all understood the importance now of us using translanguaging to show our agency as a community that has been previously marginalized and discriminated because of our race and because of our language background. And it's only when they do that, when they embrace translanguaging as, a way of exercising their agency, that's when we start seeing more systemic change. So, one of the results of my PhD, which I was the most happy about, which I didn't really write about in my dissertation, was prior to the PhD, the principals and administrators in the school as well as in the school district that were previously really opposed to translanguaging and told me personally that they don't buy into that philosophy, they became open towards it, and they, wanted to have conversations with me about how they could start introducing it at the policy level. And that had a ripple effect where then someone came up to me who was as an officer in that district level, and asked if I could conduct professional development workshops on translanguaging for all of the schools in the school district. So it had that ripple effect of shifting the dynamics of monolingual instruction in that particular school system. So I'll quickly go back to what I started off this response with to conclude. Translanguaging must always be accompanied by a critical orientation to addressing and challenging and dismantling oppressive systems, colonial systems, and linguistic inequalities for translanguaging to effect lasting change in a particular community.
Thank you so much for that. There's a lot of insight there, but I think especially in your story about like how you had experienced the impacts and the real shift of like people in different levels, kind of opening up to the idea of translanguaging. And it was interesting that you even pointed out that it wasn't actually written in your dissertation, but there was that impact. So it just kind of goes to show that like across different levels, these changes can happen in different ways. And as long as like everybody across these levels are open to the process, then it'll be the most effective. So thank you.
Absolutely, well said.
All right. So kind of building onto what you were just discussing in terms of kind of expanding beyond theory or ideology and kind of implementing translanguaging into practice. And also building off your response to Stephanie's question, where you mentioned that some students in your class had professors invite translanguaging in their written assignments. I was wondering a little bit more about submitting assignments in multiple languages. And I did my Bachelor of Education in a French specialization. So my professors all spoke both English and French and allowed students to write their assignments in whichever of the two languages they felt most comfortable with, since the professors knew both languages. But I was thinking about how that could be applied more broadly, and potentially having students be able to write assignments in the language they're most comfortable with, even if the professors don't necessarily speak the language. So in that kind of imagined reality, I was wondering your opinion on whether or not you thought the onus should be on the student or the teacher to ensure accuracy in either translations, or if there was a way to kind of have like a shared responsibility or partnership.
That's such a great question. And I'll respond to that by talking about my experience teaching this research colloquium course that you're now all taking. I taught this course. I taught this course a few years ago, and we had a similar final paper of the thesis critique assignment as well. And I had a student in my research colloquium course who speaks French as a first language and English as a second language. And the student came up to me to ask if she could submit her final paper or her thesis critique assignment in French, because she did not feel comfortable writing an entire final paper in English, which wasn't her first language. And in that moment, of course, I realized that, I've talked about translanguaging and plurilingualism, all my life, I mean, all my Aussie life. And this was my opportunity to actually enact it in practice and to practice what I was preaching. And so I said yes. And she asked me whether she should provide a translation of the paper in English as well, because she wanted to take the responsibility of doing that. But I felt that that wouldn't be a fair expectation to place on the student, and it would defeat the purpose of being able to express the ideas in their first language if I asked them to then submit a translation as well. So what I did was I asked the students permission to share her paper with my French speaking colleague, just to help me make sure that I'm understanding the translation correctly, because you could put a paper through Google Translate, but there's privacy issues, and also it's not always correct and it doesn't capture some of the nuances. And so the student was, open towards this, and I was able to then use one of my, not use, but ask for the help for one of my French-speaking colleagues to help me understand that final paper and to make sure that I was doing it justice in my evaluation. So in this particular, using this particular case to respond to your question, I think the onus was on both me as the instructor as well as the student. So as the professor, I think it was I took the onus upon myself to be able to understand that assignment. I didn't expect the student to have to provide a word for word translation, because if I did that, I'm still perpetuating English norms where I'm saying you can do it as long as you give me an English assignment. So I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take the responsibility to understand this, even if it means that I have to, reach out for help, even if it means that I have to do the extra work. It's important for me to do the extra work. But at the same time, the student, will also then took on the responsibility to ensure that they were providing me with some, support. For example, the student wrote one paragraph at the beginning of the assignment in English to give me an overview of what the assignment was. So I didn't expect the student to write an English translation, but they wanted to, because they felt really validated in me, giving them the opportunity to write this paper in French. They then automatically wanted to do everything to support me as the instructor in helping them understand this particular assignment. And just one other last example, and then I'll conclude my response. In my course that I'm teaching right now on Monday, planning and organizing the second language curriculum, students have to do a textbook review assignment where they look at a textbook and then they evaluate it. And I've told students that they can choose a textbook in any language for this assignment. And I'm not going to ask them for a translation of the entire book in English. But what I do ask is for them to provide, again, a brief overview of what this book is about in English, just to give me the background knowledge of the book so that I can evaluate the assignment. But I'll do the rest of the work, even if it means doing having an additional workload. So then just to conclude in response to your question, I do think that it's important for students to be able to submit assignments in other languages. I think that professors and instructors do need to be given more help. When my student wanted to write the assignment in French, I reached out to the people higher up than me in the program to ask if there was any support for me, if there's anything I could access at the program level, at the department level. But the answer was, unfortunately, that's not our policy. If you have not stated clearly in your policy or in your syllabus that you are welcoming submissions in other languages, then you shouldn't be setting a precedent of allowing assignments in other languages. So unfortunately, I didn't receive that system or program level support that I needed. So I think there's an opportunity there for more of that support to be provided, so that professors are not having an extra workload, but at the same time they're able to provide more options to students to be able to submit assignments and engage in discussions and submit presentations even multilingually. So thank you. Really great practical question.
Wow, I feel like it was an incredible interview. And more than an interview, it felt like a conversation, right? Shakina, thank you for being with us tonight. We talked about many things, including, of course, translanguaging, and this was really at the center, at the heart of all discussions, but also translanguaging as a right, as a resource. We talked about lesson design, lesson planning. We talked about curricula. We talked about imagined realities. We talked about reciprocity. I felt that very strongly in your response, that reciprocity that you engage in when you teach and when you do your research. So thank you very much, Shakina, for having been with us tonight. And what? How do we want to conclude? by a big applause again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here. You had great questions, so you made my job easier.